Good evening and a very warm welcome to tonight's Marlborough College Summer School lecture given by Helen Astrid on humour in opera, Arias to make you laugh, not cry. Can I ask everyone to mute themselves and to turn your videos off so we can get the full benefit of Helen's presentation? Little bit of introduction. Helen is a former opera singer and has performed with English National Opera, Garsington Opera Festival, the Linbury Studio Covent Garden and Chelsea Opera Group, and has performed in several UK premieres, and we're very lucky to have her tonight. In 2017, Helen produced The Juniper Tree by Philip Glass, receiving its UK premiere in London to great critical acclaim. She has considerable experience giving talks on the history of opera, both online and in situ, and her TED Talk, Tell Me the Truth About Opera, has been viewed by many thousands. Helen lectures for the Bishopsgate Institute, Cambridge University, Imperial College London, and the International School of London. She is Director of Corporate Singing Workshops, delivering innovative and bespoke training sessions both online and face-to-face for companies and organisations around the world. In September 2020, Helen launched Opera Live at home and is thrilled to be providing a highly rewarding and nourishing experience for both audiences and artists. It is also a rare chance for the stars of tomorrow to be seen and heard, especially during these unprecedented times. There'll be time for questions at the end of this lecture. To ask a question, simply type what you'd like to ask using the chat button at the bottom of your screens. Now, before I hand over to Helen, I would just like to let you know that we're planning on running summer school in as normal a fashion as possible. And you can be sure that we will follow all the necessary COVID guidelines to ensure the well-being of all our guests and our colleagues. So without further ado, it's over to Helen.
Thanks very much, John, and everyone else at Marlborough College Summer School. I don't know if you want to pin me onto your screen. I will be sharing my slideshow shortly. Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining me this evening. I am going to be outlining various different comedy styles in opera writing in Europe, and we'll be illustrating this with some musical examples. I'm sure that you're all aware that the term comedy or humorous is entirely subjective, and with there being so many different styles and forms of humour, factors like culture, age, political orientation play a role in what we find funny or not. So I've chosen some excerpts which you may be familiar or may not be so familiar with, but ones which I hope you will enjoy. And I'm sure that you will appreciate taking excerpts out of context is obviously not the same experiences as seeing the opera in its entirety. So before I share my slide presentation, I just wanted to sort of give you a little bit of background into some recent productions which I saw pre-COVID, obviously. Just to let you know that opera productions are really as a director's paradise, giving them carte blanche to interpret an opera any way they choose. So what may originally be conceived as a serious or tragic opera can be portrayed as comical and in some cases absolutely hilarious. Some examples of that was a production of Dido and Aeneas by Purcell, as I'm sure you know, a fine love story with a very tragic ending, and a production by Opera Up Close set in an American high school with Dido in jeans strumming a guitar, lying on a piano singing Come Away With Me a la Norah Jones, which is really an aria for the tenor at the opening of Act 3, was completely and utterly hilarious. However, all the purists in the audience had walked out after about 2 minutes at the start. So that's one fine example. Perhaps I should just ask, can everyone hear me all right? Maybe a thumbs up or just some indication that you can all hear everything I'm saying. Hopefully Yes? All right. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Another example was Handel's Rinaldo, which was a production from 2011 at Glyndebourne. Now, this is actually deemed an opera seria, a serious opera, a genre we'll look at in a moment. But the critics deemed it both witty and irreverent. It was a box office hit, and it's been revived 5 times since, and also, incidentally, set in a classroom. Directed marvellously by Robert Carson. And the third example, another Handel opera, was Barry Kosky's contemporarized production of Agrippina for the Royal Opera House. That was in 2019, and that, I think, probably was the funniest thing I have ever seen. I don't know if any of you were lucky enough to grab a ticket. They were pretty much like gold dust, but it was absolutely first class. The production obviously made relevant to our own political situation at the time, dealing with power, intrigue, sex and violence. What more do you need to sell an opera? Joyce DiDonato headed a superb cast in the title role, a sort of a femme fatale figure who was crazed to keep her power until she eventually handed that down to her deranged and completely incompetent son. All the other characters were based on real historical figures. So I just want to mention one final opera, a serious opera, which is Puccini's Tosca. And there was quite a noteworthy production in 1960 in New York, where at the end of the opera, as you know, I'm sure, Tosca jumps to her death from the Castel Sant'Angelo. And unfortunately, on this occasion, there wasn't a mattress at the bottom, but a trampoline. So the lovely Tosca bounced back up and down 15 times, much to the amusement of the audience. So I'm going to share my presentation with you now. And let's just make sure you can all hear me correctly. Right, I just want to make sure that the sound is a good quality. Can anyone please just give me a sign to say that the sound is now suitable level? Okay. All right, 1 minute. Okay, so let's go on to the screen share. Hopefully that should be a lot better. Humour in opera. Yes, as John says, arias that hopefully make us laugh and not cry. That's okay. So one differentiator between serious and comic opera is that comic opera often includes spoken dialogue, has a happy ending, and yes, you guessed it, a happy story all the way through. In late 17th century Italy, light-hearted musical plays began to be offered as an alternative to the weightier, heavier opera seria. One fine example of that is Il Trespolo Tutore, the Trespolo the Tutor by Alessandro Stradella. Heard of him? Well, maybe not, but he did write some fine arie antiche. This was an early precursor of opera buffa. It has a farcical plot, and the characters of the ridiculous guardian Trespolo and the maid Despina, oh, we've all heard of her, are prototypes of characters widely used in later opera buffa genre, Mozart's Così fan tutte, as I'm sure you know. The form began to flourish with the great operas of Mozart and later Rossini and Donizetti, exponents of the bel canto singing style, where the voice is the most important aspect. Into the early 18th century, comic operas often appeared as short one-act interludes called ballette, or their more technical name was intermezzi, and these were sandwiched between long opera seria. And another fine example is La Serva Padrona by Pergolesi. And this is just a one act and is an excellent example of that style. It was one of the first operas I ever sang in. It's hilarious. There are just 3 characters and one of them happens to be a mute role. It's a really weird piece, but lots of fun. So, as I said, these intermezzi gave way to the full-fledged opera buffa style a bit later. Opera buffa was a parallel development to opera seria, and it was intended as a genre that the common man could relate to more easily, whereas opera seria was an entertainment that was made for and depicted kings and nobility. High-flown language was generally avoided in favour of dialogue that the less fortunate could relate to, often in local dialect, and the stock characters were often derived from those of the Italian commedia dell'arte. So these are the composers that we're going to be looking at today. Rossini, Mozart, Offenbach, and yes, William Walton. So Rossini, born in Pesaro, he wrote 39 operas in his 76 years, but not in the last 40 years of his life, and we're not quite sure why that was. It could be because he had so much money, he was so successful from his early part of his career that he just became a man of leisure. That's one theory. Another is that he became so unwell that he couldn't write anymore. But the one that I think is probably the most likely is that there was stiff competition from Meyerbeer, who was German-born but wrote French opera, and this was the rise of grand opera. A couple of examples of those are Robert Le Diable and also Les Huguenots. So Rossini's music is said to glitter. The consensus was that there was nothing more ravishing than a beautiful singing voice with a beautiful melodic line, and where the melody is driven by sensitive poetry and a singable text. A noteworthy feature of opera buffa is the patter song. That's a staple of comic opera characterised by a very fast tempo. The lyrics of a patter song generally features tongue-twisting rhyming text with alliterative words and other consonants or vowels that tend to be entertaining. The musical accompaniment is likely orchestrated and fairly simple so that the text comes across. And the aria is often intended as a showpiece for a comic character, usually a bass or a baritone. Incidentally, the word patter derives from Pater Noster, or the Lord's Prayer. The habit of rushing through the words as quickly as possible gave rise in England to the term patter. So we're going to be listening to an aria from Il Barbiere di Siviglia, and a lot of these bel canto operas, even Mozart operas, they had ridiculous subtitles. This one here, L'inutile precauzione, the useless precaution, is the translation for that. So let's have a listen. Just to say that this aria, Largo al factotum, make way for the factotum, is the entrance of the title character Figaro in Act 1, Scene 1. He's on his way to his barbershop, and Figaro sings of his many talents that make him a good doctor, good barber, good matchmaker, etc., etc. And the term factotum refers to a general servant and comes from the Latin, which literally means to be able to do everything. The repeated Figaro, Figaro, Figaro section is the patter and is an icon in popular culture of operatic singing. Lots of tongue twisting and insisting on the Italian superlatives, always ending in issimo. This is a pièce de résistance of an audition aria as well. It is a cynical monologue about what a busy trade he has and how everyone is demanding his talents.
foto nella città largo. La 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 la. Presto, bottega che la mangia, presto. La 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 la. Ah, che bel vivere, che bel piacere, che bel piacere per un barbiere di qualità, di qualità. Bravo, figlio, bravo, bravissimo, bravo. La 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 la. Fortunatissimo per verità, bravo. La 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 la. Fortunatissimo per verità, fortunatissimo per verità. La 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 la. Pronto per tutto, la notte e il giorno, sempre intorno di giusta. Mil cucaglie per un barbiere, vita più nobile non usina. Tra la 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 la. Resti ripetti, la siete forti al comando tutto qui sta. Resti ripetti, la siete forti al comando tutto qui sta. Fai la risorsa, poi del mestiere, con la donnetta, col cavaliere, con la donnetta, tra-la-la-la-la-la, col cavaliere, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la, che bel vivere, che bel piacere, che bel piacere per un barbiere di qualità, di qualità. Tutto mi chiedono, tutto mi vogliono, donne e ragazzi, vecchie fanciulle, buona parrucca, presto la barba, buona sanguigna, presto biglietto, tutto mi chiedono, tutto mi vogliono, tutto mi chiedono, tutto mi vogliono, buona parrucca, presto la barba, presto biglietto, Figaro! Figaro, 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 Figaro! Ahimè, che molla uno alla volta, per carità, per carità, per carità, uno alla volta, uno alla volta, uno alla volta, per carità. Figaro, son qua. Ehi, Figaro! Sono qua, Figaro qua, Figaro là, Figaro qua, Figaro là, Figaro su, Figaro giù, Figaro su, Figaro giù. Pronto, prontissimi, sono come palme, sono le fai poco della città, della città, della città, della città, della città. Ah, bravo Figaro, bravo, bravissimo, ah, Figaro, bravo, bravissimo, ah, tu futuro, non mancherà. La 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 la. Ah, tu futuro, non mancherà. Con il fatato nella città, con il fatato nella città, nella città.
And looking rather pleased with himself there, and why not? Okay, that was Peter Mattei singing the role of Figaro in the Met production from 2011. It was conducted by Maurizio Bellini. This here we have, this is an engraving by Michel Lorenzo, that is of Lorenzo da Ponte, who collaborated extensively with lots of composers. He worked with 11 different composers and wrote 28 libretti. But the real partnership that he's well known for is that of working with Mozart on 3 operas, Così fan tutti, Le nozze di Figaro and Don Giovanni. And as opera critic Fiona Maddox describes, Don Giovanni is one of the trio of masterpieces. The personal life of da Ponte raised quite a few eyebrows as well, Born into a Jewish family, he later became a Catholic priest but attended Anglican services. He was a teacher but had no pupils, and he led a very debauched life. When he got somebody pregnant, he fled to Italy to live in New York, where he set up a grocery store that sold tobacco. On the bright side, though, he did write all these wonderful texts, which really show his character and dark side of his humour, which Mozart also had. This is the Don Giovanni himself. This is Owen Schrott, and the mezzo is Isabel Leonard as Zerlina. This would have been the duet La ci darem la mano. Again, this is from the 2008 production in New York. I'm sure you know the story of Don Giovanni. Don Juan is the legend, and he is a fictional libertine and seducer written by Spanish writer Tirso de Molina. Now, Don Giovanni was premiered at the Prague Italian Opera National Theatre of Bohemia in 1787. And it was billed as a dramma giocoso, which is a jocular drama. And that denotes a mixture of serious and comic elements, and in this case combines melodrama and supernatural elements. One of Mozart's best-known arias surely is Madamina, il catalogo è questo, commonly known as the catalogue aria. And no, Don Giovanni doesn't sing it, it's Leporello, his manservant. And interestingly, there's a corresponding scene already present in several versions of the Don Juan story in opera theatre and commedia dell'arte. And the initiator was probably a version of Il convitato di pietra, the stone guest, which is attributed to Andrea Cigognini. This example really demonstrates how a composer can capture human psychology. We're talking about the catalogue aria here. And it's also a perfect example for a basso buffo aria, the buffoon bass, which was common in the 18th century. And as with most Don Giovanni's conquests, he has his thrills and leaves his manservant, Leporello, to pick up the mess. Leporello, as you're about to hear, tries to comfort the poor Donna Elvira by telling her that she was one over 2,000 ex-girlfriends. And you can listen out for the laughing and mocking violin part, which is copied by the flutes a little later on. So when Leporello sings about tall women, the music becomes more majestic, reaching a climax. And as he sings about tiny girls, the music gets faster and cuter. And as he sings the word lista, there's an ominous chord in the orchestra, which gives us the feeling that Leporello knows his master is doing wrong and eventually he'll pay for it. An example of something that Leporello says in this aria is, oh well, in Italy he had 640, in Germany 231, 100 in France, and in Turkey 99, but in Spain already 1003, 1003, which he really rubs that salt into Elvira's poor wounds there. And you hear this word, he sings quel che fa, which is really saying, well, anyone will do as long as she wears a skirt. You know what he does, and we surely do. So let's have a listen. See if you can pick out the sarcasm here in this example. We have William Burden singing Leporello. This is from a Glyndebourne production of 2010 by Jonathan Kent. It's a slightly curtailed version, but nonetheless gives you a flavour of the catalogue aria.
Madamina, il catalogo è questo, delle belle che amò il padron mio, un catalogo che ho fatt'io. Osservate, leggete con me, osservate, leggete con me. In Italia l'Italia 640, la Magna 231, 100 in Francia e Turchia 91, ma in Spagna, son già 1.300. 1.300. Ma fra queste contadine, cameriere cittadine, van contesse e baronesse, marchesane, principesse e van d'ogni grado, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, ogni forma, d'ogni età. In Italia 640, in la Magna 231, 100 in Francia, in Turchia 91, ma in Spagna son già 1.300. Ma fra queste contadine, cameriere, cittadine, van contesse, baronesse, marchesane, principesse, e van con le ogni grado, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età.
Yes, some fine singing there by William Burden, and the role of Elvira would have been sung by Kate Royal. Well, moving across to France now. Composers in France seized the Italian model, making it their own, and called it opera comique. And this term came to refer to any opera that included spoken dialogue. Now, it is a rather complex term because it originally referred to satirical plays that contained songs, and this sort of really evolved from the vaudeville scene. Composer called Florimond Hervé is credited as the inventor of the French opérette, or opéra bouffe, which comes under the umbrella of opera comique. But he was overtaken by Jacques Offenbach, whom I'm sure you all know. His real name was Jacob Eberst, also originally of Jewish heritage, although he was born in Cologne. He quickly surpassed Hervé, writing 90 operettas, and is known as the king of French satire. Offenbach's works were intended solely to amuse. And once he found his style, he began spoofing real or serious opera because grand opera had become so grand that it was about to burst. These operetta and opera bouffe were much shorter than grand opera and contained not only lots of dialogue but also dancing. Given the frenetic pace at which Offenbach worked, sometimes he used the material from one opera and morphed it into others. A lot of composers did that, particularly Handel, who I mentioned at the very beginning. Almost as well known as Verdi when it comes to drinking songs, drinking scenes, Jacques Offenbach's drunk scene from La Péricole of 1868 is a fine example. First performed at the Théâtre des Variétés in Paris. It's set in Peru, the capital Lima, and the main character, La Péricole, has this very well-known piece called The Tipsy Aria. And that's a segment of it on your screen in front of you there. And she's obviously intoxicated when singing, and we're going to listen to it in a moment. But just the features of this aria are you get lots of sort of chromatic semitones. That means they move very sort of slide around very close to one another. We get lots of dotted rhythms to sort of denote that she can't sing a stable line. And of course it's a limited range, because I suppose if you are drunk you can't really sing a great big high note, so it's all very, very carefully sung. And of course the orchestra also are playing in a very, very simple way that really complements the vocal lines superbly and allows us to concentrate on the voice. We'll hear this in a second. So La Péricole also contains seguidillas, boleros and galops to provide this exotic feel. In a nutshell, the plot revolves around the impoverished singers Piquillo and La Péricole, because they're trying to raise enough money to buy a marriage license, albeit unsuccessfully. So the aria Je suis un peu grise is also played a huge part in the development of English comic opera, when on the 25th of March in 1875 at the Royalty Theatre in London, it was performed in English on a triple bill with Charles Collette's one-act farce called Crito Concoid Siphono Stomato and Gilbert and Sullivan's Trial by Jury, the latter of which was specifically written to be a companion piece for La Péricole. So this clip here now is from the Universal Music Videos Library, and it's sung by the wonderful Anne-Sophie von Otter. Listen out for those chromatic sliding notes and simple orchestration.
Encore une fois, s'il vous plaît. Quel dîner je viens de faire, et quelle voix extraordinaire. J'en ai tant bu, mais tant, que je crois bien que maintenant je suis un peu grise, mais chut, faut pas qu'on le dise, chut, faut pas, chut. Un peu vague, et si on marche je zigzague, et si mon œil était grillard, il ne faut s'en étonner, car je suis grise, machin. Faut pas qu'on le dise, faut pas,
And if anybody knows who the conductor is, please do let me know. I have actually written to Universal Music asking, please, who is this conductor? And also the orchestra, because I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. Okay, well, let's move on. Here we have William Walton, English composer, cuddling a lovely koala bear. I will talk about that in a moment, but I can't give a talk on the humour in opera without mentioning what was happening in Vienna and in Germany as well. We have Mozart operas and Führung aus dem Serail and the Magic Flute, examples of Singspiel. And the Singspiel is a German opera which contains dialogue, but there are also some serious Singspiels like Beethoven's Fidelio and Weber's Der Freischütz, which also retained this Singspiel form. Now, 19th century operetta was built on the Singspiel and the French opera comique model, and Johann Strauss really exploited this, being the king of the waltz. in Die Fledermaus, The Gypsy Baron, and also composer Karl Mühlhöcker, who was a long-time conductor at the Theater an der Wien, also composed some of the most astonishing and popular Viennese operetta of the late 19th century, including Der Bettelstudent Gasparoni, that name appears again, and Der arme Jonathan. Now, whilst on the subject of Germanic opera, you may not immediately think of Wagner's operas as being funny, apart from his mature comedy Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, which lasts just under 5 hours. You might find more to laugh about in the audience, particularly if you've been to the Met in New York. Having attended a ring cycle there in 2009, many members of the audience dress up in Wagner attire and have all the helmets and horns and the whole regalia. Now, it does make viewing the opera a little bit difficult, especially if they happen to be sitting in the row in front of you. But that's my experience of seeing Wagner in New York. Now, in England, we had something called ballad opera and comic operas, and they were often based on famous stories or novels. Some were spoofs of existing operatic works, and the most famous example of a ballad opera is The Beggar's Opera, written in 1728, with a text by John Gay and music by Johann Christoph Pepusch, who was German. It's believed by some to be the first ever musical, and is a clear example of a crossover work which was later transposed by Brecht and Kurt Weill into their Threepenny Opera in 1928. Now, if you'd like to find out more about the Beggar's Opera, there's an excellent article on the British Library website by Moira Goff, and it's under Restoration and the 18th Century, published in 2018. Fantastic read. Later in England, we come to the famous Gilbert and Sullivan duo, who wrote 18 comic operas and musical comedies. Sullivan hated all the trite attention, as he wanted to be known as a serious composer. Apparently, Gilbert was always frustrated with Sullivan for having ulcers and not being able to work. And to add insult to injury, Sullivan was knighted before Gilbert, which really annoyed him. In 1890, they had a big fight, and they said they'd never work together again. This is after 25 years, and much to the disappointment of the general public. Sullivan returned to serious writing and died from exhaustion, and Gilbert threw himself into a lake, though not to kill himself, but to save a drowning swimmer. As you know, many of their works are obviously in the repertoire today. Mikado, HMS, Iolanthe, Pirates of Penzance, and George Bernard Shaw, never short of a word or two in his capacity as a music critic, praised the time-honoured lilt which Sir Arthur Sullivan, following the example of Mozart and Rossini, chose for the lists of accomplishments of the Major General in The Pirates of Penzance. Unfortunately, we haven't got time to listen to that today, but it's a great listen. Sir Arthur Sullivan, after him, we were really quite limited with composers until William Walton hit the scene. Now, he wrote an opera called The Bear, which is his second and last of his operas, and it's described as an extravaganza in one act. The libretto by Paul Dean and Walton himself is based on a play by the same title by Chekhov. He began composing it in 1965 when the Aldborough Festival in England requested an opera, and it received its premiere at the Jubilee Hall in Aldborough in 1967. The opera is regarded as having enjoyed more success and popularity than its predecessor, Troilus and Cressida, because of the witty parodies and the librettist's ability to emulate Chekhov's caricatures of the three main characters. Walton was a slow worker, painstakingly perfectionist, and his complete body of work across his long career is not that large. His most famous composition is probably Belshazzar's Feast, which I'm sure you know. We can quite confidently call this a chamber opera, just 3 singers, as I say, and a small ensemble lasting no more than 53 minutes, almost the same length as Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, which appeared 280 years earlier. The aria to listen out for in The Bear is I Was a Constant Faithful Wife, sung by Yelena. And what's happened is her husband has just died before the opera begins, and Smirnov, a family friend, appears on the scene to say, well, actually, your husband was unfaithful to you during your life. That's pretty tough going. So she sings this aria, I Was a Constant Faithful Wife. And I just want to give you a little quote from it, which is interesting because it's got reminiscence of Leporello's aria, catalogue aria, which we heard, and also La Pericole. So she sings, I was a constant faithful wife, every temptation scorning, and shall be constant all my life, in mourning, mourning, mourning. The dark, the fair, the slim, the stout, tall, middle-sized and small, with brains and frequently without, he loved them all, all, all. How should a loyal wife react who in his desk discovers 100 letters neatly stacked from lovers, lovers, lovers? So to end with, we're going to hear a duet, not an aria, and this is attributed to Rossini, and I will just explain a little bit more about that. It is the humorous duet, the Buffo di Due Gatti. Being a cat lover, I have to include it, the humorous duet for two cats, and is a popular piece for two sopranos, and the entire lyrics are meow. And it's actually a mashup of three different pieces compiled by English composer Robert Lucas de Purcell. One piece is by Danish composer Christoph Ernst Weiser, and the other two sections derive from Rodrigo's aria in Act 2 of Rossini's opera Otello. So it is basically attributed to Rossini. And we have the delightful Felicity Lott and Anne Murray, and this is from Proms in 2013, with conductor Andrew Davies at the piano. Oh, this incidentally is the extract from Rodrigo's aria, which is a complete. You will hear this melody in the aria, in the duet. Here we go.
A rather huge, and well, Anne Murray is getting a very small one, a posy, I suppose one would say. Now, I don't know, this is the prelude to some kind of joke. Andrew Davis, I should say, in case you haven't noticed, is seated at the piano.
So thank you very much to Felicity Lott and Anne Murray there, and that fabulous top C at the end there. Great moment. There we have it, sort of a romp through Europe, listening to various examples and a bit of the background into humour in opera. I can highly recommend Tim Ashley's Introduction to Opera on the Guardian website, and there's a whole intriguing read on humour in opera, so that's really well worth checking out. I will be happy to take any questions if there are any. I don't know if John is with us.
Helen, I'm here. Thank you very much. So let's see if we've got, has anyone got any questions? If anyone's got any questions, just use the chat screen, the chat button at the bottom of your computer, and we'll see what comes in. So we've got one here. What was your favourite comedic role to sing, Helen?
Oh gosh. Well, one that I did do actually at the Royal Academy was by Offenbach. It was La Vie Parisienne. It was the role of Gabrielle, who is a glove maker. And it was a complete hilarious romp from start to finish. And she's got a scene in it where she has to yodel. And being half Austrian, I kind of took to that like a duck to water. I'm afraid I can't do it today because I'm feeling a little bit chesty, but otherwise I'd demonstrate.
That's great. So has anyone got any other questions? So there's one here. Who was the singer in La
Pericole. Yes, Anne-Sophie von Otter, that's right.
That's been answered. Right. So if there are no more questions, it just leaves me to thank Helen hugely for that wonderful lecture tonight.
Perhaps I can just add one thing there, John, just to let our lovely audience here know that there are some marvellous funny productions coming up on the concert in the opera houses. Things are opening up again. Opera Hollenbach have got The Marriage of Figaro. British Youth Opera are doing a rare piece by Rossini, which is a sitcom called L'Occasione fa il ladro. Loughborough Opera are doing Così fan tutti, and I think that's pretty much sold out. Neville Holt Opera in Leicestershire have doing Don Giovanni, and Grange Park are doing Falstaff with Bryn Terfel, and Garsington have got Rosencavalier, Count Henri, and failing that, there's always Opera Live at Home, which has got lots of opera artists and arias coming up, and that's all online. So there's plenty to look forward to.
That's brilliant. Right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Helen. And fingers firmly crossed that we can see everyone at summer school this year in July. So I wish you a very good night and see you soon.
Thank you.